Imagine you're 12 years old in ancient Rome, dressed in a blazing saffron veil while a crowd laughs, chants, and pushes you forward. They call it a wedding. But Rome isn't celebrating love. It's staging a transfer of power, one that ends at a doorway and begins behind it, where witnesses disappear and your future becomes someone else's business. Chapter 1. Rome didn't marry for love, it married for control. In Rome, marriage was rarely treated as a private romance. It was a legal and social mechanism designed to secure property, produce legitimate heirs, and bind families into alliances that could shape careers and politics. Roman jurists described marriage as a union grounded in connubium, the lawful right to marry, and in the social recognition that two households had agreed to merge interests. For the elite, that agreement was often the real ceremony. A Roman daughter lived under the authority of her paterfamilias, the male head of household, who controlled family property and had broad legal power over dependents. When a marriage was arranged, it was usually negotiated between men, fathers, guardians, and future in-laws. Because it involved dowries, inheritance expectations, and reputations. A dowry was not a gift of love, it was a financial instrument, meant to support the new household and, in many cases, to be recoverable under certain conditions. The Roman state also had an interest in marriage. Under Augustus, laws such as the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, 18 BCE, and the Lex Papia Poppaea, 9 CE, pushed citizens toward marriage and children, rewarding fertility and penalizing prolonged celibacy, because heirs meant stable households, and stable households meant a stable society. For many brides, often married young, sometimes close to the legal minimum, this meant leaving the only home they had known and entering a new household with new gods, new expectations, and new scrutiny. The public celebrations could be loud, but underneath the music and jokes was a blunt reality. Marriage in Rome was a transfer of status, responsibility, and control. And that raises the question Romans rarely wrote about directly: what did a bride fear most when the crowd dispersed and the private night began? Chapter 2. A girl becomes a wife, age, consent, and the weight of family honor in Roman society. A girl's marriage was often planned long before she understood what it would cost her. Roman law set a minimum age of 12 for a bride and 14 for a groom. And elite families sometimes arranged unions soon after a girl reached that threshold. The goal was not companionship. It was timing, securing alliances early, protecting a family line, and ensuring a dowry served its intended political and financial purpose. What Romans called consent did exist in theory. A valid marriage required the willingness of both parties. But in practice, the balance of power was unequal. A daughter lived under the authority of her paterfamilias, and family honor, dignitas and existimatio, could outweigh personal preference. Refusing a match could damage negotiations between households, disrupt inheritance plans, or invite gossip about a girl's character. Reputation in Rome functioned like currency. Once questioned, it was difficult to restore. Youth was also tied to Roman ideals of chastity and legitimacy. The bride's sexual status before marriage mattered. Because lineage mattered, elite households depended on clear inheritance, and clear inheritance depended on children whose legitimacy could not be challenged. That is why wedding language and ritual fixated on purity, fertility, and lawful union. The bride was not only joining a man, she was being positioned as a future mother whose body would carry a family's continuity. For the girl at the center of it all, the fear was not abstract. Marriage meant leaving her father's house, her childhood attendance, and the familiar protection of her birth family. In one day, she could become subject to new expectations, new judgment, and a new household hierarchy. Rome celebrated the transition loudly, yet the pressure behind it was quiet, constant, and irreversible. Chapter 3. The Wedding Day Theater, Veils, Torches, and Omens. That felt like warnings on the wedding day. Roman ritual turned a private family arrangement into a public event with legal and social weight. The bride was marked out visually and symbolically. Literary and antiquarian sources describe the distinctive flammeum, a saffron-colored veil, worn to signal her new status and to frame the day as a sacred transition. Her hair, in traditional accounts, could be arranged in 6 sections, sex crines, a style associated with older Roman custom and the formal seriousness of the moment. Around her waist, Romans described a wool belt tied in the so-called knot of Hercules, a fertility symbol linked to ideals of marital endurance and legitimate offspring. The ceremony itself was designed to be seen and remembered. In formal weddings, a married woman acting as a pronuba might join the couple's hands, an act emphasizing social approval and the public recognition that Roman marriage depended on. Romans also watched for signs. Omens and auspices were not peripheral superstition, they were part of how Romans interpreted uncertainty around fate, fertility, and household stability. Came the procession to the groom's house, often described with wedding torches and a surrounding crowd. Ancient writers mention ritual shouts and wedding songs, noise that served a function. It made the union socially undeniable, witnessed by neighbors and kin. But the louder the celebration, the clearer the structure behind it. The crowd was not only cheering, it was participating in a controlled transformation, one that ended at the threshold, where the public theater stopped and private expectations began. Chapter 4. The kidnapping tradition, why a bride was taken like a prize. Roman wedding custom preserved a striking gesture that ancient writers themselves linked to violence, the symbolic seizure of the bride. In Roman memory, this was explained through the foundational legend of the rape of the Sabine women. The story that Rome, short of wives, secured women by force during the city's earliest period. Later Romans retold this myth not as a literal instruction for daily life, but as a cultural origin story that helped justify why certain wedding actions looked like a staged abduction. By the late Republican Empire, the kidnapping element functioned as ritual theater. Sources describe the bride being taken from her mother's arms and escorted away with loud, public participation, songs, teasing, and communal attention. Even when symbolic, the message was clear. The bride was leaving one household and being claimed by another. That claim was not merely emotional, it was social, economic, and political. Marriage transferred dowry arrangements, reshaped kinship ties, and, most importantly for elite families, secured legitimate heirs. Romans often wrapped this in humor and celebration, but the structure beneath it mattered. The ritual rehearsed a power dynamic. The community treated the transfer as inevitable and publicly sanctioned. It also echoed Rome's broader habit of turning conquest into ceremony, transforming coercion into tradition, and tradition into something that looked natural. The procession could feel triumphant from the outside, but it also marked a point of no return. Once the bride was moved through the streets toward the groom's house, the marriage ceased to be a negotiation between families and became a lived reality, one that would soon shift from public display to private expectation behind a closed door. Chapter 5. Crossing the threshold, the doorway that marked the end of her freedom in Roman wedding ritual. The most charged moment often wasn't the vows, it was the threshold. The doorway of the groom's house marked a legal and symbolic boundary. Outside was the world of witnesses and public celebration. Inside was the authority, routines, and hierarchy of a new household. Roman religion treated boundaries as spiritually sensitive spaces. And the limen, the threshold, was loaded with protective meaning. Ancient sources describe the bride being carried or lifted over the threshold, a practice later writers explained as a safeguard against bad omens. One common interpretation was that stumbling while entering could be read as a sign of misfortune, so being carried reduced the risk of a public omen on the very first step. Another layer of meaning sat underneath. The bride's entrance was meant to look ceremonial, controlled, and unavoidable, an enacted transfer into the husband's domestic sphere. Protective customs surrounded the entry. Romans used amulets and small rites to guard against harmful influences, and they tied symbolic knots, invoked fertility, and called upon household deities. The point was not decoration, it was the Roman belief that marriage changed a woman's relationship to gods, family, and fate. She was stepping into a home with its own religious obligations and family memory, where ancestors and household spirits were honored in daily practice. This is where the horror in Roman marriage often lived. Not in the supernatural, but in structure. The threshold ritual made the transition public, physical, and final. Once inside, the celebration still echoed outside, but the bride's life increasingly belonged to a new set of rules, watched by a new set of eyes. Chapter 6. Inside the house, the hidden rituals number. Outsider talks about once the bride crossed into the groom's house, Roman marriage shifted from public celebration to domestic incorporation. What happened next was shaped by religion as much as by law, because a Roman household was not only a family unit, it was a religious community. The home had its own sacred center, often the lararium, where the household honored the lares, protective spirits of the family, and the penates, guardians associated with the household's provisions. Entering this space meant more than moving addresses, it meant being attached to a new set of domestic gods and obligations. Roman writers and antiquarians describe small rites meant to secure fertility, stability, and acceptance within the new household. The bride could be guided by married women, matrons whose presence signaled legitimacy and social continuity. These attendants were not merely ceremonial. In elite homes especially, older women helped enforce expectations, proper conduct, respect for household authority, and the social performance of modesty and loyalty. Food, offerings, and symbolic gestures mattered because Romans believed prosperity and harmony depended on correct practice. The bride's transition was therefore managed through ritual acts that introduced her to the household order, human and divine. Even when details varied by region and class, the purpose stayed consistent: to bind her identity to the husband's family line and to the household's public reputation. By this point, the street noise was fading, but the stakes were rising. In Rome, duty was not a private feeling, it was a social demand reinforced by custom, religion, and surveillance. The bride was no longer only a daughter being celebrated. She was a new member being measured by family, by servants, by neighbors, and by the standards of a society obsessed with legitimacy and honor. Chapter 7. The night itself, consummation, power, and the bride's silent pressure. In Roman culture, the wedding did not feel complete until the couple moved from public ritual to private reality. Legally, Roman marriage was not defined by a religious sacrament or even by consummation. Jurists emphasized mutual intent, affectio maritalis, and the recognized status of husband and wife. But socially, the expectation of sexual union on the wedding night was strong, because it signaled the start of what marriage was ultimately designed to produce: legitimate heirs. Roman literature and wedding songs make clear that the community treated the transition to the bedroom as a moment of intense attention. The jokes, chants, and teasing verses that accompanied processions were not random entertainment, they were cultural pressure, spoken aloud. In elite households, especially, the bride's marriage was an alliance watched by family networks, and her fertility could become a topic of immediate interest. Under the empire, Augustan marriage legislation reinforced that pressure by rewarding childbearing and penalizing prolonged childlessness or avoidance of marriage. For many brides, often young by modern standards, the night carried multiple burdens at once: unfamiliarity, bodily anxiety, and the knowledge that her value in the new household could quickly be judged through pregnancy and reputation. The imbalance could be sharper when marriages involved age gaps, or when a woman entered a household where authority was already firmly established by in-laws and household staff. This is the core of the horror embedded in the system. Rome framed the wedding night as natural, necessary, even virtuous. Yet the structure around it, law, custom, family ambition, and constant scrutiny, could make it feel less like a private milestone and more like a test, with consequences that lasted a lifetime. Chapter 8. After the night. What she became in Roman law and Roman memory. By the morning after the wedding, the bride's status had changed in ways that Romans considered permanent, even if the law behind it could vary. In everyday social terms, she was now exor, a wife, and her reputation became tied to the honor of a new household. But Roman marriage came in different legal and customary forms, and those differences mattered for power. Older Roman tradition emphasized marriage cum manu, where a wife came under the hand of her husband and effectively transferred from her father's authority into her husband's legal control. By the late Republic and into the imperial period, however, many elite marriages were sine manu, in which a woman remained legally connected to her birth family and could retain property rights through her dowry arrangements and family support. This shift did not remove social pressure, but it could change a woman's leverage, especially in cases of divorce or inheritance disputes. Whatever the legal form, a new reality set in quickly. The wife was expected to manage household duties at her rank, maintain sexual respectability, and, most importantly, produce children who would secure the family line. Roman moral writing and social practice placed intense emphasis on a woman's chastity and public behavior, because any hint of scandal threatened legitimacy. In elite circles, that means constant observation, by in-laws, by servants who carried gossip, and by neighbors who noticed patterns. Rome's memory of the ideal wife celebrated modesty, fertility, and loyalty, often more than happiness. The wedding night was not an ending, it was the starting gun for a long performance, one where a woman's security could depend on childbirth, family politics, and the fragile protection of reputation. Chapter 9. The twist. Rome's wedding horror was hidden in plain sight from the outside. A Roman wedding could look like a celebration of family, tradition, and community. The symbols were bright and familiar: veil, torchlight, songs, public congratulations. But the deeper pattern is what makes the story unsettling. The most coercive parts of Roman marriage were not secret crimes. They were normalized customs, performed openly, protected by law, and repeated across generations as how things are done. Roman society treated marriage as infrastructure. It stabilized property, organized inheritance, and created alliances that supported political careers. Under the empire, Augustus made those priorities explicit through legislation that encouraged marriage and childbirth and punished long-term celibacy. In that environment, the bride's personal experience mattered less than the outcome, a lawful union that produced legitimate children and strengthened household status. This is why so many rituals feel double-edged. The joy of the procession also functions as public pressure. The careful management of omens reflects anxiety about risk, but also a need to make the transfer look inevitable and blessed. The threshold rites protect against misfortune, yet they also dramatize the fact that a bride is entering a new authority structure, one where behavior, fertility, and reputation are monitored. The horror, then, is not a hidden cult or a single shocking moment. It is the system's ability to turn fear into tradition, and tradition into virtue. Unavoidable. Are they celebrating love, or are they celebrating control? And when the torch goes out and the veil is folded away, Rome's public theater ends, but the consequences remain. Closing. What Rome's weddings reveal about Rome itself. Roman marriage rituals survive in fragments, law codes, poems, moral treatises, and antiquarian descriptions, because Romans documented what they valued: order, legitimacy, and continuity. When those sources are read together, a clear picture emerges. The wedding was not simply a personal milestone. It was a public mechanism that moved wealth, fixed alliances, and protected inheritance through the production of legally recognized children. That is why so many ceremonial details focus on visibility and control. Witnesses mattered because social recognition mattered. The procession mattered because the community helped certify the transfer. The household rites mattered because religion, in Rome, was inseparable from domestic life. Even where legal forms shifted over time, especially as sine manu marriages became common among elites, social expectations remained powerful. A wife's reputation could elevate or damage an entire family network. This does not mean every Roman marriage was uniformly miserable or violent. The evidence is too varied for that. But it does show why anxiety was built into the institution. A young bride could face a life-changing transfer into a new home where fertility, modesty, and obedience were not merely private virtues, they were demanded outcomes. Reinforced by tradition, gossip, and sometimes by law. When modern audiences hear wedding, they often imagine romance and choice. Rome forces a different perspective: marriage as governance, and intimacy as social policy. The darkest part of Rome's wedding night is not that it was secret. It is that so much of it was public, celebrated, and treated as normal, because in Roman life, the family was the foundation of the state, and the bride stood at the center of that foundation. If you want more real history stories like this, no myths, no Hollywood, hit subscribe. And comment, Rome, so I know to make part 2 on Rome's darkest family rituals.